now doing this beachside interview, not a fireside chat, with none other than Sukhinder Singh Cassidy, who has had a remarkable journey as a women tech leader, coming from Canada to Silicon Valley and going from success to success. And we'll kind of unpack her journey over the next 20, 25 minutes. Sukhinder, welcome to NASSCOM.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Great. I think I recall, 20 some years ago, meeting you at this little company called Jungle, where I think that was the first, you kind of moved from Canada. That was probably your first job in Silicon Valley at this hot startup. And just starting that journey, I remember as I was an advisor to the company got bought pretty quickly, within a couple of years.
6 months of my
right?
joining. Yes.
And suddenly you were at the startup, and then suddenly you're at Amazon. So what was that like? What was that transition, and how did you manage all that?
Well, first of all, I think we all know that entrepreneurship is a journey as much about timing as it is about capacity and capability. And if you think about what was happening in that era, Jungle was one of the first comparison shopping engines, but itself was a pivot. When I joined the company, it was a jobs kind of platform for aggregating jobs across the web and kind of showcasing jobs. But pretty quickly, I think on day 2 of my entry into the company, the founders, a set of Indian entrepreneurs, as you know, out of Stanford CS program, basically were like, hey, look, Yahoo, which is our main customer, is asking us to aggregate e-commerce listings instead of shopping listings and be able to compare prices on all these goods that are coming online in categories like books and video and toys and so on. And so we pivoted the company. I think on my literally within my first week, I moved from sort of being a PM on jobs to being told I needed to call retailers and set up a shopping service where we compared online retail listings for price comparison for consumers. And I think the important thing there was really the timing of that move, because as you pointed out, e-commerce was starting to explode. It was a whole kind of proliferation of retailers, but it was not easy for customers to compare prices. And so as Jungle pivoted its technology very quickly, within the first 6 months, I called 100 retailers, of which one was Amazon.com. And unbeknownst to us, Jeff Bezos, even then, which was 1997, 1998, was a newly public company, but had his own imagination of what a marketplace would look like. Instead of Amazon owning every category as a retailer, really setting up a marketplace where third-party retailers could list their products on Amazon and showcase them. So think about that, 1997, 1998, he's building his first-party business, and he already has the idea for marketplace. And as shopping is exploding, he sees Jungle and our technology, and within 6 months, he buys it. So, as I always say, a remarkable experience for me, but it really speaks to the importance for entrepreneurs of pivoting and looking at macro tailwinds. That is the story of Jungle in some ways.
And how was it going into Amazon as an executive? You were at a startup and then suddenly you're in this bigger company. What was that journey like?
Well, I've come to understand and appreciate now the relative size of companies. I thought it was big, yet Amazon at the time was only about 1,200 people, including people in the warehouse. So, at headquarters, there were probably 300 or 400 people who were kind of non-warehouse and CS folks. So just think about that for a moment. So remarkably, it was still pretty startup-like in terms of you would be in multiple meetings with Jeff. Certainly the management team of the company, we all got exposure to because Amazon was relatively small. And because we were working on this strategic new capability in marketplace, maybe even more visibility. So Amazon in those early days, I think what has stuck with the company is that customer obsession. I remember, we all moved to Seattle. There was 60 of us or so who moved to Seattle. And that very first winter working at Amazon, basically the company shuts down everything but the warehouse. And 100% of employees moved to doing warehouse shifts, including Jeff. So probably the thing I remember most is its customer obsessiveness. And we were pick, packing, and shipping products from basically kind of first or second week of December, maybe. 100% of the company was in the warehouse. Pretty remarkable.
Wow. And then how did you decide to go to a startup and co-found a startup after Amazon, right? You got the entrepreneurial bug?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, look, I moved to Silicon Valley wanting to be an entrepreneur, but not really knowing how. So deciding that sort of the best thing I could do was take a risk to put myself in the proximity of entrepreneurial activity. And so Jungle was this taste. And, on the one hand, when many people would call me foolish for having left Amazon, given its journey. But in 1998, 99, it's not really obvious. yet that Amazon is going to become what it becomes 25 years later. And what is obvious to me is like, you're right, I really want to start a company. And luckily for me, the founders of Jungly went on to become pretty prolific angels in the Valley. And so pretty quickly, a technical founder came to me, a guy named Raj Raman, sorry, who came to me and basically said, "Hey, I've built a technology. I'm out of UCSD that aggregates, your information across various financial services sites. I have 4 technical co-founders, and I need a business co-founder." And that was all through kind of the angel network of the Jungly founders. And so, when offered the opportunity to become, a co-founder, literally 2 years into my kind of, arriving in Silicon Valley, it was pretty hard to resist.
No, and I can tell already from your profile, you love to take risk, and you've written a book about that as well. So, I mean, leaving Amazon, doing a startup, and then from that startup, you went to Google. What was that like?
Well, interestingly, I chuckle to people. I'm like, we think all moves, we think risk follows a very predictable pattern, right? Like if you take a big risk, you get a big reward. If you take a small risk, you get a small reward. But I'd say my career is an anti-testament to that, meaning the move to Google was actually, we would agree, a relatively small risk. After building Yodlee for 5 years, I wanted to go start another company. I was not going to be the CEO of Yodlee. We had a great CEO that I'd helped hire. So like I had sort of topped out at year 5 or 6 in my own startup. There was no other job for me to do, like literally. And I was seeking a new challenge. And I moved to Google, and one would argue that that was, as I said, a pretty low risk kind of move. But I moved to Google to start a new business called Local and Maps. And then from Local and Maps, I ended up kind of building our international business. And I think Google is a perfect example of sort of the lack of correlation between risk and reward. Small risk, very outsized rewards at Google, because I participated in sort of all the tailwinds of internet growth through one platform, like 100% of the tailwinds. Google grew as long as the internet was growing, and it provided a way to search an increasing treasure trove of web pages and results, right? It's kind of remarkable. So I think that's an example of sort of, taking small risks and getting outsized rewards. And sometimes when we take large risks, like Yodlee was an incredible learning journey. Financially, it was not it was far from my biggest success.
And how did you end up at StubHub, this website that buys and sells tickets for events? I mean, that was like completely a big risk too. I would think that was a big risk, becoming CEO of this company, right?
It was, but I think it was maybe risk 5 in a series of risks I took post Google. So again, people often imagine that I went from success to success, but risk is like anything else. If you want to do it once, you're unlikely to get the rewards. And this is the thesis of the book, by the way. If you want to get the rewards of risk taking, you likely have to do it multiple times, getting increasingly smarter, right? And kind of be in a feedback loop of risk and reward, or risk and learning. And ultimately, one of your choices may unlock an outsized reward, but you don't really know which one when you go in. So I think the move to StubHub for me was, 10 years after making a decision to leave Google and pursue e-commerce as my next career chapter. I left Google in 2009. I was, president of APAC and LATAM, including India. I was sort of as senior as I was going to get at Google without being CEO, which was not going to happen at Google for neither me or my business colleagues. We all sort of topped out. People like Sheryl Sandberg and Tim Armstrong, who ran North America, myself, Nikesh Arora ran Europe. He was another counterpart. And so we all ended up leaving and going on different journeys. And my journey was sort of deciding that e-commerce was going to go through another big wave of innovation beyond price comparison and shipping speed, really lifestyle e-commerce, this business of wants, not needs. I was CEO of 2 companies, including one of my own, before I got the opportunity to run StubHub, which of course is, a large e-commerce bet on the experience economy. And so the way I think about, StubHub, it is the result of making multiple moves into e-commerce. I became an investor, I became a board member, I became an entrepreneur, and I spent 7 years learning the fundamentals of e-commerce, including running my own company, while sitting on the board of others and investing in yet another group of companies. And it's really that series of choices that led me to get the StubHub opportunity.
No, I like your thing of taking risk often, because that's what gets you the success, because it happened in my journey as well. One startup failed, second startup failed, you keep going till you get hopefully something that succeeds.
Absolutely. Well, I always say to people, like, if you want to take a risk once, that might be the riskiest move of all. Because if you're betting on one big move to get you where you want to go, that's what I call luck. If you want to be in a repeated relationship with risk taking, where you always get the yield, right? The yield might be a learning, the yield might be an immediate success. That's unlikely. The yield is likely to be informing your next choices, right? As micro and macro, right? To unlock kind of the cumulative reward of risk taking. So maybe there's only one move more risky than making only one choice, and that's making no choices at all. That's just staying where you are. But risk is a muscle, as I often say, and so you want to really build the muscle in order to get its cumulative return.
And so, as you were preparing the book and writing the book, when you look back at it, what were some of the takeaways for you that you would like to kind of tell this audience of entrepreneurs who implicitly are risk takers, as they start companies? I mean, what are some of the things they need to think about and so forth as they undertake their journey?
Look, I think that there's a bunch of different risk-taking lessons in the book, but here are one or two that really are quite important for entrepreneurs that I think they underweight. Entrepreneurs, like many others, think by sheer force of will and execution, they can make something happen. That's what I call being heads down. But often, and Silicon Valley is full of this, between great markets and terrible teams, great markets win. And between great teams and, terrible markets also win. Meaning you can't really execute your way out of a bad market. Timing is everything. Lifting your head up and being, attuned to those macro conditions is really key. I mean, Yodely and Joyce, my second company, were both well ahead of their time. And so it took both a lot of capital and, quite frankly, not great customer economics to try and make those businesses work, because the customer wasn't where we were as a technology. The Boardlist, on the other hand, has had maybe the least technical investment of any company I started, yet, hit the market at a point where the diversity tailwinds around diversity leadership on boards, recruiting, are only growing. And so I'm actually, trying to grow the business with the market as opposed to well ahead of the market. So I think being very attuned to macro conditions and moving in concert with macro conditions, what I call being heads up and heads down, that's called being a smart risk taker. When we just put our heads down and we grind and grind and grind and think we can out execute our way out of a market, I'm not sure I agree with that thesis. I think it's about pivoting to keep finding product market fit, but keep in mind, a lot of that is being heads up. And I think for a lot of entrepreneurs, being heads down comes very naturally to them. Being heads up, to the environment, always taking in data, being on customer pitches, selling, kind of trying to understand, where the opportunity is pretty key. There's one other one I'll mention that I think is very critical for entrepreneurs. And again, I think is a less known skill. I always say, like, look, being an entrepreneur is the ultimate bet on yourself, right? Yet, how can you bet on yourself if you don't know yourself? Like what your superpowers are, what your strengths are, what your areas of development are. So if you want to take a smart risk on yourself, you better start with understanding who you are. And I will be in rooms full of MBA students or CEOs and ask them the question, like, what's your trademark strength? And less than a quarter of the room will put up their hand. And I'm always like, well, either you're all being falsely modest and you don't know what you're uniquely great at, or you really don't know. But I don't know how you're about to build a company around yourself and decide who to hire, which risk to take, what your weak points are going to be, where you need to supplement yourself. What kind of bet are you making on yourself, where you're uniquely strong and where you're not? How are you really building a team that complements you? And I think so much of startups are about building teams, yet entrepreneurs, fail to look in the mirror and understand who they uniquely are, what they uniquely have to offer, and quite frankly, what their blind spots are.
Those are great points. Now let me come to the elephant in the room, which is we know all of Silicon Valley and the tech sector woefully lacks women in business. It's in my mind, it's gender equality, not diversity, right? You would think that we, so you as a woman entrepreneur taking risk, how do you navigate this when there are not that many women who might be investors, who might be board members? How do you look at that, and how do you navigate and take that kind of risk as a woman as opposed to someone like me?
Right. Well, I think so first of all, I think there are a bunch of maybe 2 or 3 lessons that have become clear in my career. And some are gender related, and some are, areas where gender provides, quite frankly, a barrier and an unconscious bias. And even with the same actions, you're received differently, right? But so let's just talk about what's similar and what's different if you're a woman leader. So what's similar is like any entrepreneur, female, man, what have you, right? It's a series of choices and unlocks in order to create the business. Like there's so much more risk in being an entrepreneur than being a woman entrepreneur. Like being an entrepreneur is fraught with risk, right? But here's the thing: when you're a woman, what you don't, or a man, like when you go in and are trying to become kind of best in class, that includes selling a big vision. So sometimes I think that what we need to do is represent, well, kind of as between a big vision and a small vision. Somebody like next door to you is seeking the same capital, and on the same idea, their vision may be bigger than yours. So what is true, and the research shows it, is women are hesitant to take even the good risks, and men more indiscriminately take risks, even bad risks. One of the risks you need to take as an entrepreneur is the risk of selling a big vision. So if you go in with sort of only the vision of what you're sure you can deliver, in the competition for fundraising and quite frankly capital, big ideas, win over small ideas, and quite frankly, both have the same execution risks. So you can walk in and promise somebody the star or the moon. Either way, nobody knows what's going to happen next. So learning how to, I would say, take the risk to sell a vision, take the risk of learning how to sell, that is the same, quite frankly. Now, let's come to what's different. How it's received might be fundamentally different. And we know this is the world of unconscious bias. When people who walk in and who look different than the regular pattern, or kind of stereotype of yesterday's entrepreneur, some, I don't know, non-diverse, male, engineering, dropout of like a world-renowned CS program. Like if that were, who's young, like, so you may do everything right and walk into a room where simply the fact that you look different means that the message equally delivered, is not equally received. That is actually the real risk, that women leaders face. It's not lack of ambition. It may be needing to sort of lean forward when kind of research suggests that women, are more sensitive to risk taking. It may be like, may feel a little more uncomfortable for you to do that. But let's presume like that's, you're doing, dollar for dollar, word for word, the same pitch as somebody who, fits the stereotype. You will need to take many, many more at-bats simply to have, kind of that message received equitably. That is true. I always say to people, I had a pretty soft landing into my first startup experience. I was with 5 technical co-founders who quite frankly fit that stereotype pretty darn well. So it's like, no wonder it was pretty easy to fundraise my first company. Oh, by the way, my second company, I was exiting Google as like, the leader of a multi-billion-dollar division. Oh yeah, and had 2 technical co-founders. Also fairly easy to fundraise. Now let's go to company 3. I'm the founder and chairman of the Boardlist. I've watched my own first-time CEO, who's a female founder, who's a female CEO, go out and try and raise funding for our startup. And do I believe she encountered bias? Absolutely. The number of people who told her that a product for diverse leaders was meant to be a nonprofit, quite a few. Had no technical moat, quite a few. 3, they weren't sure that there was a big enough market for diversity recruiting. Oh, quite a few. When I could name any number of talent platforms that are raising, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, to grow, talent marketplaces everywhere. So I've seen firsthand what it's like for a female CEO who's a first-time CEO to go out on that journey. And, I stepped in to help her, and I still believe that, we encountered our own fair share of bias. So I've seen both sides. I've had the benefit of like, being with the team and, my own resume and raising money. I've also seen when, first-time female entrepreneurs, not just the one, not just the CEO of the Boardlist, but quite frankly, many first-time entrepreneurs that I've backed, like Katrina Lake at Stitch Fix. If you were to ask them about their experiences fundraising, perfect example of same message, same ambition, differently received, which means you have to, work doubly as hard to, than your counterparts.
Let's talk a little bit about Boardlist, because you're trying to do good as well in this new company, right?
We're doing good, but it's the irony of all worlds is if you build a company today trying to do good and you look different, people ask you if you should be a nonprofit. I'm like, I'm not really sure why doing good and making money are, dichotomous. I'd love to build a sustainable platform that can do good and, and create great economic opportunity.
And so give me the business model for Boardlist and what you're trying to accomplish. How does that work?
Sure, sure. And by the way, to be fair on the board list, for all of those who aren't aware, when I first started it, it was my side hustle. Today I'm the founder and chairman. I didn't know what it would be, but it was simply a platform where, to your point, to do good, I wanted to crowdsource from experienced leaders and board members a list of women they thought would be great for boards, just so we could solve this, like, where are all the great women kind of problem that used to sort of exist when people talked about building, diverse boards. And this was circa 2015. It began as a project. It was never a nonprofit, but it also was not, I would say, a company with commercial ambitions. It was simply what I call a project. We accumulated a list, we created an MVP platform. By the way, that list kept growing. Today, the board list is 20,000 members in a three-sided marketplace of people who either nominate women and people of color to boards, any diverse underrepresented groups. 2, people who want to self-apply and be nominated, be found. And 3, companies coming and looking for, board members and soon to be diverse executive leaders for their C-suite opportunities as well. So the board list is a three-sided marketplace. It has recommenders or endorsers, people who recommend. It has candidates, people who are leaders who are diverse and want to find opportunity. And it has companies that search. The business model, we're early. I would say we've only started monetization this past year. And it's really subscription based for people who are in the talent and recruiting business, free to candidates. So we offer kind of leaders the opportunity to be discovered for free. And increasingly over time, we can offer adjacent services to subscription, which include, as you can imagine, candidate advisory services. Certainly we can look at, whether or not we extend even further below the C-suite, though I don't think that's necessary for us to build a remarkably big business.
Wow, what a journey, Sukhinder. I mean, it's incredible. I think what I take away from this, the number of risks you take is as important, as not taking risk at all or just taking one risk. I think that stands out. And the
Yes.
other thing, like you said, is all the thing that women face in the workplace of the unconscious bias. And you're right, when a woman and a man present maybe a similar business plan, the women has so many more objections to overcome. So just
Oh wait,
plowing
and
through.
and there's one more. When you actually are kind of fairly aggressive and risk taking, even that it has a negative connotation. So keep in mind that women are told to
Yes.
take more risk. Yet when they show up aggressively, that is received differently in terms of a
Right.
likability factor
Right.
than their male counterparts. So but look, I always say to people, that doesn't take you off the hook. That doesn't mean you can go through the world with a chip on your shoulder or go through the world understanding that being an entrepreneur has multiple facets of risk and return. This just happens to be an extra couple of layers for women and an important one. But there are many more risks you need to take besides just being a woman when it comes to, building a great company. What we
Well,
need the world to
Sukhinder,
be easier.
absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been fascinating 22 minutes, I think, but we could have gone on for an hour because the amount of information you have and the journey you've taken and the experience you share and your book itself, we could have spent so much more time, but really, thank you so much for being with us and all the best with your journey ahead.
Thank you so much. Take care.